Hey everybody, and welcome to the channel. My name's Steven. This is Northwest Small Batch Brewing, and going to talk about my method of lagering today. And I say my method because there are so many ways you can lager, and everybody has their own method. And it depends whether you're using dry yeast or fresh, liquid yeast, whatever. It all varies, but this is how I do it, so maybe that'll help some people that brew the same way I do. Before I get started, it would help me out a lot, as usual, if you would look down and hit the subscribe button. Nothing helps this channel out more than having people subscribe right now, because only about 10% of everyone who watches my videos actually subscribe to my channel. So thank you. I appreciate it. It gives me a reason to keep putting out more videos. All right, so let's get started. So basically the whole process of lagering is adjusting or altering the temperature you ferment your beer at. And of course there's this new sort of fad going around, it's maybe not that new anymore, of pressure fermenting, where you don't necessarily need to lager. You can just ferment your beer under pressure, and you can do it at a normal, even a warmer temperature, because the pressure changes that. And some people call those pseudo lagers, because you're not technically lagering the beer. Lagering is the process of the temperature changing. So I still do it the old-fashioned way. I use a sort of modified chest freezer. I got a cheapy, chest freezer that was just big enough to hold my fermenter, and I bought a fairly inexpensive Inkbird controller. I'll put it in the description, a link to the Inkbird. You just plug your freezer into that, and that goes into the wall, and then you can tell it what temperature to set at, and the temperature of the freezer will turn on and off depending on what temperature you've set it to. So to start with, before you pitch your yeast, you finished brewing, you've got your wort. Generally speaking, you want to chill the wort down. You don't want to pitch the yeast into warm, lager yeast into warm wort. Now I use dry lager yeast. There's not a lot of options out there for dry yeast. There might be a couple for lager yeast anyway, because it's just one strain of yeast. This will not work really for liquid yeast. When I get to that point, I'll explain. Well, basically, you need to research it yourself, because I don't use that. I haven't researched that. But if you use liquid yeast, some of the temperatures and things are going to be potentially different. But for dry yeast, initially you want to chill down your wort to between 48 and 53 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like 9 to 12 Celsius. So that's pretty cold, colder than normally you would pitch your yeast, but not too much. So let's say I would just chill it down to about 50 Fahrenheit, and then you pitch your yeast like you normally do, and then you have your initial fermentation. Well, you pitch the yeast, you let it ferment. You ferment it between 50 and 55, so that's between 10 and 13 Celsius. So really, you could just chill your wort down to about 50, and then ferment between 50 and 55. Look at the yeast packet and look them up. They will usually give you also some direction on what temperature range you should use. So that initial fermentation at a colder temperature is how you start. And then it depends on the gravity of your beer, how long you leave it fermenting at that temperature. If your beer is less than or equal to 1060 original gravity, you're going to let it sit there for about 5 to 8 days fermenting at that temperature. In my opinion, the longer it is better, so I'd recommend 8 days. And then if it's higher, right, if your original gravity is 1061 or higher, so a higher gravity, you're going to need to lager it longer. Well, we haven't started the lagering yet. You're going to need to ferment it longer. So between 7 and 14 days at that initial temperature of 50 to 55 Fahrenheit or 10 to 13, or I'm sorry, yeah, 10 to 13 Celsius. So depending on your gravity will determine how long you're going to ferment. Remember, that's for dry yeast. It is different for liquid yeast. So please don't follow that. You need to look it up if you're using liquid yeast. So after that initial period, we might want to call that your primary or your main fermentation or whatever, then we start the lagering process. At that point, you're going to start ramping the temperature up, all right? Because when you're at that low temperature, you have diacetyl and stuff forming, and you need to do something called a diacetyl rest, which is basically raising the temperature very slowly so that you don't stress the yeast, and then you hold it at a temperature that's warm enough to let diacetyl form and release before you can chill it back down. So we ramp it up at this point very slowly, let's say 5 degrees Fahrenheit every 12 hours. That's probably equivalent to about 1 degree Celsius, maybe even half a degree Celsius every 12 hours until you reach about 65 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, which is between 18 and 20 Celsius. So I usually use a calendar for this so that I can mark, okay, I'm going to move it up this much this day, this much this day, right? So at whatever point, however long that takes you to do it, you very slowly ramp it up until you're between 65 and 68. And then you do what's called the diacetyl rest, right? You're going to let it sit there at that 65 to 68 Fahrenheit, what did I say that was, 18 to 20 Celsius range, for 4 to 10 days. Now, some people will say less, some people say, whatever, but 4 to 10 days, you want to give it enough time to release the diacetyl so you don't end up having that, because you do not want that flavor, and it's very recognizable in lagers. So once that rest is done, you're going to ramp it back down again to a very cold temperature, very cold. So again, yeast does not like sudden changes in temperature. It will cause it to send off flavors. So you want to do it slowly. So ramp down 5 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like 1 to 2 degrees Celsius every 12 hours until you reach about 35 degrees Fahrenheit. You can go colder. 35 Fahrenheit is like 1.5, maybe 2 degrees Celsius. You can go colder, but the problem is you don't want to freeze your beer, right? So I usually say 35, I'm good. I'm not going to try to, go too crazy. And then you want to maintain it at that really cold temperature between 3 and 5 days before you put it in the kegerator and add CO2 and carbonate it and whatnot. And some people will cellar it for even longer than that. But that's how you lager. You ferment at a low temperature, you slowly raise it up until you get to a warmer temperature where you hold it for a few days for that diacetyl rest, and then you ramp it back down to a cold temperature again where you hold it at a very cold temperature for a while. So that's my general directions for lagering, and you do need, it's super helpful to have some kind of method. I guess you could use like a glycol chiller or something, but I just find that the freezer and the Inkbird temperature controller make it super easy to do. So that's about all I have. If you have any questions, put it in the comments. Remember that if you use liquid yeast, it's going to be a little different, and these temperature ranges are not always the same. Some people, like I said, everybody seems to have their own method for lagering, but I think this is a pretty good generic, steps to follow if you're just getting into lagering and you want to give it a shot. So, hey, thanks for stopping by. Always appreciate it. There'll be another video next Saturday evening as usual. And until next time, everybody keep on brewing. See you soon.